Hi, good evening. I want to thank the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and the American Center in Moscow for inviting me to give this talk tonight about a slice of American architecture, which is the evolving skyscraper. My name is Michael Wyetzner. I'm an architect here in New York City. I have a firm with a partner named Frank Michielli called Michielli Wyetzner Architects. And a lot of the work we do has to do with existing and historic buildings. And for the past 6 years, I've been doing a series of videos with Architectural Digest, and a lot of them deal with the architecture and the history of New York City. So I'm going to begin tonight's talking about a structure that is not quite a skyscraper, but is sort of the precursor. And that is the Brooklyn Bridge. When the Brooklyn Bridge was completed in 1883, it was the tallest building in New York, and it was the tallest building in Brooklyn. Those two cities were separate at the time, and they wouldn't become one city until consolidation in 1898. And the bridge was begun in 1869, just a few years after the Civil War. And for many years before that, they had been talking about building a bridge across the East River. But the span was too great. And it wasn't until John Roebling came up with this idea with his great invention of cables that they were able to accomplish that. And before this, the only way across the river was by ferry, and the ferry service was difficult. In the winter, the river would freeze, and basically, it was really starting to affect business. On the right, you could see this beautiful drawing of one of the towers right here. I was lucky enough to get invited to the New York City archives and view a number of original drawings, many of which, of the Brooklyn Bridge, many of which were done by the actual engineers, including Washington Roebling. So the Brooklyn Bridge is actually a composite of two kinds of bridges. It's a cable stay bridge and it's a suspension bridge. And what those are is, a suspension bridge takes a cable and drapes it between two towers, and it forms a catenary. And then from that catenary, drops vertical cables down, and that supports the roadway, which you see here. And a cable stay bridge takes the cables directly from the towers and attaches them to the roadway. And that's what you see here. And so when you look at this photograph, you could see the diagonals of the cable stay system, and you could see the verticals of the suspension system, and they form this beautiful sort of lacy finery. And the juxtaposition of that against this great Gothic granite tower is just spectacular. And it makes this beautiful piece of architecture. And here's another one of those beautiful drawings that you could see right here, the original drawings, this wooden cage that contains these stones, which was a bulwark for the construction. But part of the charge of building this bridge was they were not allowed to interrupt shipping traffic. Shipping traffic had to continue. And so they built the roadway for the bridge at 135 feet above high tide. The East River, being so close to the Atlantic Ocean, is actually subject to the tides. And to this day, Navy ships can be no taller than 135 feet so that they could pass under the bridge. And so part of the way, they not only had to design the span and the bridge, but they had to figure out a way to build it. And what they did was they came up with this ingenious idea of these wooden caissons. So what a lot of people don't know is the Brooklyn Bridge, the towers for the Brooklyn Bridge, are actually supported on wood. And these caissons, caisson is just a French word for chest, like treasure chest. And these caissons are like giant flat domes. And then underneath that dome, which you could see right here, is the area where the men would work, excavating down. So they sunk these caissons down to the riverbed, which is 40 feet below the surface. And then they excavated by hand 45 feet down to bedrock. And so what they did was they pumped in pressurized air to keep the water out. And then the men worked under this very low space in really horrible conditions. But I just want to point out this fantastic drawing, another one of these original drawings. And I love how they show the water with these horizontal lines, and then these squiggly curlicues to indicate sort of the eddies of the water. And they show the end grain of the timbers with these beautiful sort of sepia hatch that they do. And then they actually draw the workers, which I just think is great. And you could actually see them there working away with their pick and shovel. And it's really, really difficult work and in terrible conditions. It was dark and dank and stale air and really difficult. And many of the workers died building this bridge. And as they excavated down, they would pile these stones on top, and it would help sink the caisson to the bottom. And then when they were finished, they filled the chamber with concrete. And those caissons are still at the bottom of the river to this day. As I said, the work was extremely dangerous, and a lot of people died, including John Roebling, the brilliant engineer and inventor who was behind this bridge, who was the designer of this bridge. He was not only a brilliant engineer, but he was also a bit of an eccentric, and he didn't believe in modern medicine. And at the outset of construction in 1869, his foot got crushed against the pier, and he refused medical attention. And a few weeks later, he died a very, very painful death from tetanus. And so his son, Washington Roebling, who was also an engineer, took over. And Washington Roebling was a decorated colonel in the Civil War. He had fought valiantly at Gettysburg. And so he took over the overseeing of the construction. But then he came down with the bends, caisson disease, decompression sickness, as it's called, and the bends. And what the bends is basically just nitrogen bubbles in the bloodstream, but it's extremely painful, and it affects the joints, and it affects the brain, and it causes terrible, terrible headaches. So then he became incapacitated, and so his wife took over, Emily Warren Roebling, and she saw the Brooklyn Bridge through its completion. She's one of the great unsung women in history, and she was the first, when it was completed, to ride across in May of 1883, to ride across the span in a carriage holding a rooster, which was a symbol of victory. So now I want to just talk about the innovation. So that's the Brooklyn Bridge, and that's sort of a precursor to tall buildings in New York. And so there were three great innovations that made tall buildings possible. And when I say tall buildings, I mean anything over 6 stories. That was basically the limit of a walk-up back then. So the first one was carbon steel. Steel had been around for a long time, but it was very difficult to regulate the amount of carbon in it. And if there was too much carbon, the steel was brittle. If there was too little carbon, the steel was rubbery. So it wasn't until Bessemer came up with this system where he was able to remove all the carbon and then re-inject the right amount, that steel became useful. And then it basically built the railroads and built skyscrapers. And the second is the safety elevator. The elevator had been around for a while as well, but they used to plunge. The rope would get disconnected from the pulley, or the rope would snap and the car would go plummeting down to the bottom of the shaft. So until Elihu Otis came up with his idea for safety brakes and invented the safety elevator, finally they were able to have a safe way to go. And those two innovations essentially changed the skyline of cities across the world. And then the third, believe it or not, is mass transit. As these buildings got bigger and bigger and developers were investing more and more money into them, they needed to fill these buildings with as many workers as they could. And the existing trolley systems just couldn't fulfill that need. They couldn't bring enough people in. And the subway was actually able to do that. The subway was actually able to fulfill the need. So you really can't talk about tall buildings without talking about Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan was this great Chicago architect by way of Boston. And he didn't invent the skyscraper, but he certainly codified it. And what he did is he based it on a classical column so that there's a base, there's a shaft, and there's a capital. And you could see that at his Wainwright building in St. Louis, Missouri, that he did in 1892, where he has a 2-story base, which is for retail, and then he has this 7-story shaft, which is for offices, and then he has this attic floor at the top, or this capital, as we call it, and that's sort of the formula that he used. And the other thing he did was he evoked the sort of cellular nature of office work by making all the verticals, whether they carried a load or not, whether they were a structural column or not, he treated all the verticals the same and then just put spandrels between them and sort of created this honeycomb, which again is very evocative of office work. And then he did the same thing in Buffalo a few years later at the Guarantee Building. He made this building out of terracotta. Building is a mix of brick and terracotta. And then he does that until the Bayard Building in New York. So if we look at a blow up of the Wainwright Building, and you could see all the verticals are exactly the same, whether they're carrying a load or not. And then you see the spandrels between them, these ornamented terracotta spandrels. And the spandrel is basically just covers the floor slab. So it goes from the sill of one window to the head of the window on the floor below. And it's this very simple system of these 3 elements. But in New York, at the Bayard Building, what he does is he starts to articulate the structural column, which you could see right here, and he expresses it. And he not only expresses it, but he then celebrates it. And so you could see them here with these larger and thicker verticals that are supporting the structural column, and then you see these more delicate, thinner, cylindrical, rod-like, non-structural verticals between. And what he does is he takes an arch and he connects the 2 structural columns, and then he takes 2 smaller arches that go to the non-structural column, and then he puts this beautiful round window, and he creates this trifoil window at the top. And then to celebrate it even more, he puts this angel with her wings spread, and then fills it all with this beautiful terracotta ornament and these capitals at the top. So now all of a sudden he's expressing the structure of the building. So now I want to, I love this photograph of sort of World War I era downtown Manhattan. And in the distance, you can see the Brooklyn Bridge, which, as I said, at the time it was built, was the tallest building in New York City. And if you follow the line of the roadway, you come to this building here, which is the New York World building, which was built by Joseph Pulitzer. The New York World was a newspaper. Pulitzer was the publisher. And it was designed by George Post, the great New York architect who also did City College, one of the great hidden gems up in Harlem. And when it was built, this was the tallest building in the world in 1890. And it was right on Park Row, which is right by City Hall, which is still there today. City Hall is still there. Unfortunately, this building is no longer there. All the newspapers were located along Park Row back then. This building was demolished in the 1950s to make way, ironically, for a larger entrance ramp to the Brooklyn Bridge. But when you look at the center of this photograph, you can see some other buildings. So this is the Singer Building, which in 1908, when it was completed, was the tallest building in the world. And if you go to the left, to the north, you can see the Woolworth Building, which in 1913, when it was completed, was the tallest building in the world. And then just to the right of that is the Municipal Building, which is still there at the end of Chambers Street, as is the Woolworth Building is still there. But the building that really changed things, the building that really caused a sensation in a bad way and a great outcry, was the Equitable Building, which was not the tallest building in the world. When it was built in 1915, it wasn't even the tallest building in New York. But the Equitable Building was massive, and people were really concerned that it was going to block the sunlight from coming down to the street, and they felt something had to be done. And if you look at this photograph, the thing that all these buildings have in common is they all go straight up from the sidewalk, each and every one. Even the Woolworth Building, it's got this bustle on the back, but the tower on the street goes straight up from the sidewalk. So that was going to change. The Equitable Building was going to change that. And the Equitable Building is not really a very distinguished tower at all. I mean, it's got the Sullivan-esque formula of base, shaft, and capital. And you can see this little arch here is this grand triumphal arch entrance here. But you can see how it looms over the street in this photograph. I mean, it was really, it caused quite an outcry. So what happened is they created the 1916 zoning resolution in New York. And what they did was they required buildings to set back from the street in after 1916. And so let's take a look at one of the most famous setback towers and probably the most famous skyscraper in the world, and that is the Empire State Building. So the Empire State Building was built in 1931. It's 102 stories tall, and it was built in the depths of the Depression. And the Empire State Building is all about verticality, and it does that at two scales. At the grander scale, from a distance, it does that by the architects created this channel which broke down the mass so that you get these more slender masses on either side, and it makes it appear to be taller. The other thing they did to make it feel taller was they made the spandrels, which I'll show you in a minute, they made them dark, like the windows, so that all you're left with are these, what you see are these limestone pinstripes, as it were, these vertical pinstripes, which make the building appear taller as well. And these all rise up to this great spire and antenna. And that antenna sits on this lovely cylindrical spire, which you could see here. And that spire is actually supported on these winged buttresses, which in turn is supported by this stepped metal and glass pyramid, this ziggurat, which sits on this stone crown, which is in fact the 86th observatory floor, the 86th floor observatory. And the intent of this spire, believe it or not, was to have dirigibles dock to it. That was the intent for this. That never actually happened except once in 1931, right after the building opened for like 3 minutes. The photograph you're looking at here is actually doctored, but they really made an effort. They really wanted this to happen, and they included beacon lights at the top of this spire to draw the dirigibles in, and they had a whole system of winches and pulleys that that secured it with this elevator. And then I love this little tiny staircase. You know, you're 1,200 feet in the air, almost a quarter of a mile in the air, and then you'd come down this tiny, tiny little staircase onto this exterior observatory platform, which just must have been terrifying. So let's talk about the setbacks and what that actually means. So as I said, so the setback tower is basically means you go up a certain height and then you set back, then you go up a certain height again and you set back again. And the idea is that you never penetrate this invisible sky exposure plane, as they call it. And so you could see how the architects dealt with that here. And they almost created like their own little city with all these masses. And what I really like about this is they treat them all differently. So they use the same vocabulary and the same palette of materials, but they do each one a little different. So for instance, here it's a series of double bay windows that wrap around, but then over here it's single bays that wrap around, and then those are flanked by and then those flank a double bay, and then it's double bays again up here, single bays, and then this is the bottom of that channel, and then it's a series of double bays again, and then as you go up the tower, they even go to a triple bay, which is flanked by 2 double bays, and the idea being that they sort of lessen the amount of limestone as you go up, so the stripes, the limestone stripes, get less and less as you go up. But it almost forms, like I said, these masses almost feel like its own city unto itself. The other extraordinary thing about the Empire State Building is that it was built in 13 and a half months. All 2 million square feet of it was built in 1 year, 1.5 months, which is just extraordinary. It's really astonishing. There's some reasons for that. I mean, today you'd be lucky if you get a house built in 13 and a half months, let alone a 2 million square foot building. And today it would take, 4 or 5 years easily to build a building this big. And a lot of people think that the reason that they were able to do this was, like I said earlier, it was the depths of the Depression. There was not a lot of building going on. And so they had the pick of the best workers in every trade. So they had the best plumbers, the best electricians, the best steel workers, and they were able to, and the best masons, and they were able to, these workers worked extremely efficiently. They were the best at what they did, and they worked very quickly, and subsequently they put themselves out of a job in 13 and a half months. So now I want to jump ahead 21 years and show you a glass curtain wall building, a corporate tower, as it were. This is the Lever House, built for the Unilever Corporation. So it's only 21 years later from 1931, but it's a completely different world. The globe has experienced the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, World War II, the Holocaust, nuclear annihilation at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and post-war New York is a completely different place than it was in pre-war New York. And it's the rise of the corporation, the organization man, as it were. And Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill was sort of the first architecture firm that was also like a corporation. So it's the first time that a corporation is actually designing for a corporation. And glass towers had been thought about and been around for a while. As early as the early 1920s, Mies van der Rohe, the great titan of modernism, was looking at glass skyscrapers. Corbusier, the other great titan of modernism, had actually at his Salvation Army building in Paris had included a glass facade. And even at the UN 2 years before, Corbusier and Oscar Niemeyer had done the UN building, which has its own glass facade. But the Lever House is the first that is all glass, that it's completely wrapped in glass. As you can see here, these sides are solid on the UN Secretariat building. So what the architects did, which is quite ingenious, I think, is they took the building and they turned it perpendicular to the street. And they created sort of this void in the, up above on the street wall. And then they placed this slab of a tower on top of this plinth, this two-story plinth. And they subsequently put this plinth on top of these pilotis, or these, which is a French word for columns, a fancy French word. And these pilotis actually are open to the street. So this is Park Avenue, as you can see right along here, and this is 53rd Street. And so what this plinth does is it actually holds the street wall. You can see the street wall of the buildings here, and here's the plinth. This is the Racket and Tennis Club by Macomb, Mead and White, which is still there along Park Avenue. And in the distance, you can see a post-1916 tower with its setbacks. But obviously, the architects were looking at what Corbusier and Oscar Niemeyer and Lucio Costa had done in Brazil for their Ministry of Education building 10 years before, where they had also turned their tower perpendicular to the street, but they had left the corner open, as you could see here, where Bunshaft at SOM, the architects, they had enclosed the corner and created this really lovely exterior courtyard space. So just quickly, the difference, I just want to show the great difference between a traditional sort of masonry enclosure with spandrels and a glass enclosure. So it's a glass curtain wall. It's called a curtain wall because the glass hangs off the structure like a curtain. And where we were looking at the Wainwright building or the Empire State Building, it's a series of either, of masonry verticals with a spandrel between that's metal or masonry, and then a window sits between those two spandrels. When it's a curtain wall, it's all glass, and the only thing separating the glass are these metal caps, or these mullions, as we call it. So where there's an opaque, where there's a spandrel here that's metal or masonry, here the spandrel is glass. It's opaque glass, and then above that is the vision glass, which you can look out the window. So that is what composes an all-glass facade versus more of a traditional masonry facade. And so here is that lovely courtyard space that they made. And you can see Park Avenue beyond, the cars parked. And you can see those mullions, those metal caps that you see right here, and they're around here. And it's really a beautiful space, this garden space. But the thing about glass buildings is they're a little messy. You could see all the different window treatments, and that becomes an issue later that I'll show you how that was sort of solved. But this really is sort of like the first corporate tower in New York with the flat top. And New York, being New York, has a lot of corporations have their headquarters here, and so they have a lot of corporate towers, and let's take a look at another one by Mies van der Rohe. So what Mies does, which is different from what SOM had just done for Unilever, this is the Seagram building, which is just a few years later. It's 1958. But Mies sets his tower back, and he sets it all the way back and creates this plaza along the street with these beautiful fountains, as you could see here. And he creates this one great monolith of a building. And he creates this sort of new kind of urban space. But he breaks the street wall by doing that, where before at Lever House, that two-story plinth held the street wall. And so the other thing Mies does, which is quite interesting, is he takes bronze I-beams and places them on the outside as ornament. So he's sort of symbolizing the structure of the building, the steel I-beams, but he does it in bronze. And the other thing that's different from Lever House is Mies makes his spandrels out of bronze. And then he takes the entire tower and he tints all the windows additionally to be bronze. So what that does is it makes it feel more monolithic. It makes it feel like one tower, and he accentuates the verticality of it with these I-beams. And so if we look back to the Wainwright building again, where Sullivan had these brick verticals that he treated exactly the same, and then he had his spandrels with windows between them, Mies is doing the same thing. So he has these verticals, which he treats exactly the same, just like Wainwright, where you don't know which one is actually holding a column and which isn't. And then he has his spandrels and the glass between. And the other thing he does is he illuminates the ceiling. The idea is to bring you in. You could see, and he uses these translucent panels, and you could see where those panels are removed, how all the lights actually form that illuminated ceiling here. And the idea is to bring you in visually into the building. So if we look at the street wall, so what he's done was, at the time the building was built, this was the street wall. Here's the plaza while it was still under construction. Here's the tower. Behind that tower, actually, he has a little setback building behind there, actually. The famous Four Seasons restaurant is in that little setback along there, or was. It's no longer there. And the other thing is, this is diagonally across the street from Lever House. So this is Park Avenue right here, and this is 53rd Street. We're just looking in the opposite direction. We're basically looking from the Lever House at this point. So the street wall, it just basically means it's the facades of the building that come up along the property line and form this wall, as it were. So when you create a plaza, you set it back and you have this public plaza. And the city planning department liked this so much that they incorporated it into the 1961 zoning resolution. And they gave a bonus. So if you set your tower back, they allowed you to build more flat floor area, and you could build higher if you set your tower back. And so that was all well and good, but the problem with that is when you just have one on a street, it's fine. You create an interesting space, but when you have a series of them, and I just want to point out this beautiful drawing by Mies from 1921, and look how similar this tower looks to what he was thinking about all those years before. But so back to the plaza idea. So if you have a series of plazas like you do along 6th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, all of a sudden you lose the street. You not only lose the street wall, but you also lose the idea of the plaza, and all you have is this sort of amorphous setback zone which does neither. Okay, now I want to jump ahead almost 50 years and talk about a building where the structure is expressed in a very definitive way. And that is the New York Times building, another corporate tower. But this one is by the Renzo Piano Building Workshop. And what Piano does, which I think is really quite clever, is he takes a glass tower and then he wraps it in this veil of ceramic rods to prevent the sun from coming in. And then he pulls that veil back at certain places and exposes the structure. And by pulling that veil back, he also accentuates the height of the building. And the other thing the New York Times did, is they put this enormous aerial on the roof of their building. And I think it says, that although the New York Times, which started in 1851 as a broadsheet, the New York Times recognized that the future was going to be digital. And so I think they were symbolizing that with their building by putting this enormous aerial on the top of it. And then I love this photo where they put their original masthead, that Gothic typeface, on this high-tech ceramic rod facade. And the other thing that they do is they regularize all the lighting, which helps with that messy look that you saw before on the Lieber House. And I just want to point out one other thing, is that post-1916, you can see that New York became a city of setback towers. All these buildings set back. Everywhere you look, there are setback towers. So now if we take a look, so this is how the building looks when it hits the street. So you could see the columns come down, and he very much expresses the column. He puts a veil on them, but he's not hiding them so much as sort of dressing them. And he expresses the diagonal bracing, and you could see where the glass is 2 feet back, and you could see the beams and the columns are expressed, and then you could see how he puts the ceramic rods on top of that. I love here that you could see the stairwells on the interior are the exact same angle as the bracing. Of course, they would have to be. And then, again, you see how that's set back. And then if you see it from a distance, again, you could see that it rises up. You could see that great, huge aerial at the top. And you could see how he brings the veil up above the roof line to conceal the mechanical, which makes it appear even more slender as he sets it back. And then again, from a distance, you could see the diagonal bracing, and you could see the thickness of the facade right here, which really indicates how the rods go on top of the columns. So instead of the ornamental structure that Mies was doing, Piano here is really showing exactly how the building is built. And Piano was part of this whole high-tech movement that started in Britain in the 1970s. And he really made his name when he won the competition with Richard Rogers, who's a famous British architect, to design the Pompidou Center in the center of Paris at the Beaubourg. And what they did there is they put everything on the outside, right? They put the structure on the outside, as you can see here, and they put all the ducts and the pipes and the elevators. Everything's on the outside of the building. They're expressing exactly how the building is made and what it's composed of. They were doing that in an effort to make these sort of clear museum floors, as it were. And then you can see here on the street, so back to the Times Tower, you could see how he cuts these other windows into the ceramic veil, the ceramic rod veil. So he holds it back. You see the diagonal bracing. But here he cuts in this window, so there's glass behind there, a full wall of glass. And then he has these rods, and then he cuts a sort of phenomenal window outside of an actual window, which I really like. It's like this symbolic window. It's very similar to what Louis Kahn did in Dhaka when he would, in this warm weather climates, when he would create these buildings and then wrap a cloak around them and then cut holes in that cloak to let the light in. So here are some other Manhattan towers that by other high-tech architects, as it were. This one is by Norman Foster. This is the Hearst Tower, where he did this diagrid. This is along 57th Street and 8th Avenue. Here's 8th, here's 57th. And then Richard Rogers did a building down at 3 World Trade Center. Again, Richard Rogers. What's interesting about this building is that it sort of has a similar feel to what Piano was doing at the New York Times, but I don't think either of these are nearly as successful as Piano's building for the New York Times. So now I want to jump ahead to 2015, and I want to talk about a completely different kind of skyscraper, and that is the super tall. So the super talls are pretty much built for residential buildings. They're not corporate office towers. They're residential. And as a residential building, it's built out of concrete. And so this is 432 Park Avenue. It's almost 1,400 feet tall. It was designed by Vignoli. And this building is really interesting in that it's basically 6 12-story buildings stacked on top of one another. And between each of those is a 2-story open floor, 2 stories of open floor that allows the wind to go through, which is very clever. And the other thing it does structurally is it's a grid of concrete. So what you're looking at here is the actual structure of the building itself. So it's this concrete grid. It's a lattice, as it were. It's like a perforated tube, and you could see it from a distance here, how it appears like a perforated tube. And then it also has the proportions of like a support column, of a structural column that would be, say, holding up a building. It looks like this could be one of the columns outside of the Seagram building or the Lever House. And so I can't help but think that Vignoli was thinking about Los and his Chicago Tribune competition entry in 1922, where he did this pun, this visual pun, where he made the whole tower a column, as it were. So the interesting thing about I just want to jump back for a second, is that all this building is, in terms of structure, is this grid, and then he just places windows between that grid. And so you could see that closer here, and I like this progression. I wanted to show it to you. So if you've ever driven up to Cape Cod, there's this town called Fall River in Massachusetts, and Fall River has all these great brick warehouses and factories, and it's almost like a progression of seeing the structure of masonry evolve. And so if you start with one of the older ones where you just have this big masonry wall and you punch windows in it, as those windows get bigger, all of a sudden you start to read sort of a grid of verticals and horizontals. And eventually that leads to a grid like this, where all it is a grid of structure of concrete. And so the thing about concrete buildings, and the reason most residential buildings are built like this, is because with concrete you could do flat slab construction. And what that means is you have no beams. So in a pre-war building, as it were, like you see the interior here, you have steel that's encased in concrete, but you have a column, and then you have a beam, and then you have smaller beams to frame into that beam. But those beams have depth, and with flat slab construction, you don't have beams, so you don't have that depth. And what that means is you can get a tighter floor to floor. You can get a shorter floor to floor distance, which means you could get more floors in the same envelope, which for developers means more dollars. You know, you could get, you could build more. So the other thing that's a problem for these super talls, as it were, though, is that they tend to sway. They're anchored only at the ground, and they're extremely tall, and so they move in the wind, you know, and the winds are pretty strong up there. And so as they move, they tend to sway, and you can get seasick being all the way up high in them. And the other thing is it causes maintenance problems. Pipes that are supposed to be completely vertical and plumb start to go out of plumb and crack. Elevator shafts that need to be completely plumb and vertical, the rails all of a sudden shift and they get jammed. And so to counteract this, most of these towers have what's called a mass damper at the top, which is just a giant gyroscope, which is intended to counteract the forces of the swaying. But it doesn't always, it doesn't work completely, and the buildings still sway a bit. And you can see some of the other super talls. They're all along 57th Street, actually. So you can see here the Steinway Tower, built by Schiff Architects. You can see 157th by the great French architect Christian Portzenpark. You can see the Nordstrom Tower, which is just next to the Art Students League. And you could see another really tall residential tower by Robert Stern Architects. So I just took this picture a few weeks ago, and it really shows how the skyline of New York has really changed. This is taken from the top of the Great Lawn in Central Park. And you could see that the skyline used to be just this, right along here. And you could see how these buildings have totally changed it. So this is 432 Park, the building we were just looking at. There is the GM building, which is, and here's 9 West 57th. But here's the new Chase Tower, which is getting built. This is 1 Vanderbilt, which is just gone up. You could see here there is the Steinway Tower, there is the Nordstrom Tower, there is the there is 157th, and there is the tower we were just looking at by Robert Stern. So these super talls have completely transformed the skyline of New York, at least in Midtown Manhattan. And the other thing is, most of the people that live in these towers are very wealthy, and because they're the only ones who can really afford these apartments. And at being very wealthy people, you know, they have homes all around the world, and so they don't spend a lot of time in these spaces in New York, in their homes in New York. So quite often many of them sit vacant. A lot of these apartments sit vacant, which is just a shame when you think of you know, all the housing needs that are in every major city in the world. So that is how I'm going to end the presentation, and I will now take some questions. If I could just get to see the chat. So Anton, are you able to remove the screen share? Or do you need me to do that? Okay, I figured it out. Question from Tam. Are there any future buildings that are being proposed? I don't know, actually. I'm not sure about that. Another question. When super tall skyscrapers sway in the wind, do people living on the higher floors actually feel it? For example, can objects inside the apartment fall or move because of this sway? Yeah, they actually do feel it. I don't know that objects actually fall, but they certainly feel it. And like I said, it causes the same feeling as seasickness, essentially. Is it safe? Another question, how does it feel on the top when the buildings are moving? Is it safe? Is it possible to work then? Again, it's safe. Yeah, the swaying is actually a good sign. It means the building won't fall down. But it's definitely disturbing. Oh. Interesting. When the towers fell, how did they reinforce the? Oh, wait a minute. I'm going the wrong way here. Sorry. Okay. Comment from Venya Friedrich. Thank you, Michael, so much. Love you have. Okay. Thank you. So here, interesting lecture. Thank you. When the towers fell, how did they reinforce the base and surrounding streets when the pipes came up? I'm not sure which towers you were talking about. I assume you mean the World Trade Center towers. But I am not completely certain of that. Anyway, I think that's it for the questions. Oh, here's another one. Do you know if the houses in New York are built from top to bottom? I don't know what that means, but how do you envision the future of New York skyscrapers beyond the current phase of super talls? I think the super talls are going to continue. From an engineering perspective, they're quite remarkable. But I think they're going to still build them because they make money, and developers will as long as they're able to make money, they will continue to do that. So, which New York buildings you consider the most iconic? Which are your personal favorites? Okay, my personal favorites, actually, I showed a few of them. I love the United Nations building. I think it is one of the best in New York, and I love the New York Times building. I think that one is one of the best in New York as well. Those are two of my favorites. I mean, you have to love the Empire State Building. You have to love the Chrysler Building. Those are, I didn't talk about the Chrysler Building today, but those are just fantastic buildings. I think the Chrysler Building has the distinction of being the tallest building in the world for the shortest amount of time. I think it was only 6 months, and then the Empire State Building surpassed it. I also like the Lever House very much as well. So what are some examples of sustainable or green architecture in New York today? So there's a few. There's a tower over on 42nd and 6th Avenue. That is a green tower, which has a very high LEED rating. There are there's the tower at the New York Times itself, tries to be green by blocking a lot of the sunlight that comes into the building. What's the tallest building in the world at the moment? No, the tallest building in the world is Burj Khalifa, I believe. I think it's in the in the United Arab Emirates. Dubai, thank you. Yes. Is New York architecture more about innovation or tradition? That's a great question, and it's about both. And I think I sort of showed that in the sort of progression of buildings that I tried to show. That one design leads to the next design, leads to the next design, and architects are always trying to be as innovative as possible, and still be sort of following modernist traditions, I believe. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Okay. Two more just came in. How do you see the future of New York's architecture in the next 20 to 30 years? I think it's going to be a lot greener. I think the codes have changed a lot, and I think a lot of it has to do with the mechanical systems, the heating and the air conditioning in buildings. And I think a lot of it is going to be more about the efficiency of heating and cooling in New York. That's what I would say. And I think that is really where it's headed, and devising different envelopes to contain that will still be part of that. But I really think that it will be about energy savings. And what advice would you give someone visiting New York who wants to experience this architecture fully? This is the last question. So I think you should ride the subway, and you should go onto the Staten Island ferry, and then you should walk up Broadway, and you can see nearly all of Manhattan. It'll take you a few hours, but that's how you should do it. Broadway runs the entire length of Manhattan, and you can see nearly everything by doing that. And the other thing to do is walk across 42nd Street. You could also experience quite a lot of Manhattan by walking across 42nd Street from one river to the other. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I really enjoyed doing this, and see you all again. Bye.